The morning sun peeked through the windows of Christopher Vaughan's penthouse office. At 45 years old, he was one of the most powerful men in New York City. His company, Vaughan Enterprises, had just closed another billion-dollar deal, and the champagne was flowing freely among his executives. Christopher stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the city below. He adjusted his expensive tie and smoothed down his perfectly tailored suit. Everything about him screamed success, from his designer shoes to his perfectly styled silver-streaked hair. But behind his confident smile, there was an emptiness he couldn't explain. Sandra Martinez, his assistant for the past 5 years, knocked on his door. "Mr. Vaughan, the board is waiting for you in the conference room." Christopher nodded, gathering his papers. Another day, another victory. That's what his life had become. As he walked through the corridors of his empire, employees scrambled to get out of his way. Some called him brilliant, others called him ruthless. He didn't care either way. He had worked too hard to get where he was to worry about what people thought of him. In the conference room, 12 men and women in expensive suits sat around a massive mahogany table. They all stood when Christopher entered. These days, everyone stood when he entered a room. It was a far cry from his childhood, when he and his mother Evelyn could barely afford rent in their tiny apartment in the Bronx. "Ladies and gentlemen," Christopher began, his voice commanding attention, "today marks another milestone for Vaughan Enterprises. The Miller acquisition is complete." Applause filled the room. Christopher allowed himself a small smile. This was what he had always wanted: power, respect, success. He had clawed his way up from nothing, leaving behind everything and everyone who might hold him back. After the meeting, Christopher returned to his office. Sandra followed with his schedule for the day. "The charity gala is tonight, Mr. Vaughan," she reminded him. "Your date, Miss Claire Henderson, will meet you there." Claire was the perfect society girlfriend, beautiful, sophisticated, and most importantly, from a wealthy family. She understood the world Christopher now lived in. Unlike his mother, who had never understood why brand names and social connections mattered so much, Christopher pushed away the thought of his mother. He hadn't spoken to her in 15 years. The last time he saw her, she had been standing in the doorway of their old apartment, tears in her eyes as he walked away. He had been so angry then, angry at their poverty, angry at the sacrifices they had to make, angry at the world that looked down on them. That evening, Christopher stood in front of his closet, selecting a tuxedo for the gala. His phone buzzed, with a message from Claire. "Can't wait to see you tonight, darling. The press will be there. Wear the blue tie." Of course she would think about the press. Everything in Christopher's life now was about appearance. As he tied his tie, he caught a glimpse of an old photo tucked away in his drawer. He usually kept it hidden, but sometimes late at night he would look at it. It showed a much younger version of himself with his mother at his high school graduation. They were both smiling, despite wearing second-hand clothes. His mother's face beamed with pride. The sound of his phone ringing snapped him back to reality. It was his lawyer, Richard. "Christopher, great news about the Miller deal," Richard said. "But there's something else. Remember that loan you got when you were starting out, the one from the anonymous benefactor?" Christopher remembered it well. 20 years ago, when he was trying to start his first business, a mysterious loan had arrived just when he needed it most. It had been enough to rent his first office space and hire his first employee. That loan had been the foundation of everything he had built. "What about it?" Christopher asked. "Well, I've been doing some digging, trying to clear up any loose ends. There's something strange about where that money came from." Christopher checked his watch. He was already running late for the gala. "Can this wait until tomorrow?" "Sure, but then we'll discuss it tomorrow." Christopher hung up. He had a gala to attend, photographers to pose for, hands to shake. The past could wait. As his driver navigated through the busy streets of Manhattan, Christopher's mind wandered back to the loan. He had always assumed it was some angel investor who saw potential in his business plan. The money had appeared in his account right after every bank in the city had turned him down. At the time, it had felt like a miracle. The car stopped at a red light in a less prestigious part of town. Christopher usually avoided these neighborhoods. They reminded him too much of his past. As he waited for the light to change, movement in a nearby alley caught his eye. An old woman was huddled against the wall, surrounded by garbage bags and cardboard boxes. Something about her seemed familiar. The way she held herself, even in such desperate circumstances, had a dignity about it. Christopher found himself staring, trying to place where he might have seen her before. The woman looked up, and their eyes met through the car window. Christopher's heart stopped. The silver hair was matted and dirty now. The face was more lined, more tired than he remembered. But those eyes, he would know those eyes anywhere. They were the same eyes that had watched over him when he was sick, that had filled with tears of joy at every small achievement, that had looked at him with unwavering love even when he walked away. "Stop the car," Christopher whispered. Then, louder, "Stop the car!" His driver slammed on the brakes, startled by the urgency in his boss's voice. But Christopher wasn't paying attention anymore. He was already opening the door, his expensive shoes hitting the dirty pavement as he ran toward the alley. The woman tried to shrink away as he approached, as if she was ashamed to be seen. That small gesture broke something inside Christopher. "Mom," his voice cracked on the word. "Mom, is that you?" Evelyn Vaughn looked up at her son, her eyes filling with tears. "Christopher?" The world seemed to stop spinning as mother and son stared at each other in that dirty alley, 15 years of silence stretching between them like an ocean. Christopher fell to his knees beside her, not caring about his $1,000 suit or what anyone might think. "What happened?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why are you here?" His mother's hands, once so strong and capable, now thin and trembling, reached for his face. "My boy," she said softly. "My beautiful boy." Behind them, the city continued. Its endless rush, horns honked, people shouted, life went on. But in that moment, Christopher Vaughn, the billionaire who had everything, realized he had nothing at all. And he was about to learn the true cost of his success, a cost his mother had paid in full. Christopher couldn't believe what he was seeing. His mother, who had always been so proud, so strong, was sitting in a dirty alley surrounded by garbage. Her clothes were worn and dirty, and she looked so thin it broke his heart. "Mom, please," he said, taking off his expensive coat and wrapping it around her shoulders. "You need to come with me right now. I'm taking you home." Evelyn tried to protest, but she was too weak. Christopher lifted her in his arms, shocked at how light she felt. Behind them, his driver stood by the car, mouth open in surprise at seeing his boss, who usually wouldn't even touch a door handle, carrying a homeless woman. "Open the door," Christopher ordered. The driver scrambled to obey. As they drove through the city, Christopher held his mother's hand tightly. She kept looking at him with tears in her eyes, touching his face as if she couldn't believe he was real. "Why didn't you tell me?" Christopher asked, his voice breaking. "Why didn't you let me know you needed help?" Evelyn just smiled, that same gentle smile she had always given him when he was upset. "You were building your dream," she said softly. "I didn't want to get in the way." The car pulled up to Christopher's penthouse building. The doorman's eyes widened when he saw Christopher helping Evelyn out of the car, but one sharp look from his boss kept him quiet. Inside the penthouse, everything was sleek, modern, and expensive. Evelyn looked around in wonder, her eyes taking in the life her son had built for himself. "First thing we need to do is get you cleaned up," Christopher said, leading her to the guest bathroom. "I'll have Sandra bring some clothes for you." He called his assistant, who was surprised to hear from him. "Sandra, I need you to go shopping right now. I need women's clothes, size small, everything from underwear to outerwear, and I need them delivered to my penthouse immediately." "But Mr. Vaughn, the gala, cancel it. Cancel everything for the next few days. This is more important." While they waited for the clothes, Christopher ran a warm bath for his mother. As he helped her get settled, he noticed how thin her arms were, how prominent her bones had become. His heart ached, thinking about how long she must have been living on the streets. "I'll be right outside if you need anything," he told her. Sitting in his living room, Christopher's mind was racing. How had this happened? His mother had always been so resourceful, so capable. She had worked 3 jobs when he was growing up, just to keep food on the table. What could have possibly reduced her to living on the streets? His phone buzzed repeatedly. Messages from Claire asking where he was, from board members wanting to discuss the Miller deal, from his lawyer still trying to tell him about the loan. He ignored them all. When Evelyn emerged from the bathroom, an hour later, wrapped in a fluffy robe, she already looked more like herself. Her silver hair was clean and combed, and some of the exhaustion had left her face. The clothes Sandra had brought were simple but elegant, exactly what his mother would have chosen for herself. "You look beautiful, Mom," Christopher said, his voice thick with emotion. Evelyn smiled. "You always were a sweet talker." She sat down on the couch, her movements careful and deliberate. "But we need to talk, Christopher." He sat beside her, taking her hands in his. They felt so small, so fragile. "Yes, we do. I need to know what happened. The last time I saw you, you had an apartment, a job." "I did," she nodded. "But sometimes we make choices for love that others might not understand." Before she could continue, Christopher's phone rang again. It was Richard, his lawyer, for the third time that evening. "I'm sorry, Mom, let me just tell him to call tomorrow." But when he looked at the screen, he saw a message that made his blood run cold. "The loan that started your company. I found out where it came from." It was from the sale of a house in the Bronx. The seller was Evelyn Vaughn. Christopher stared at his mother, the pieces suddenly falling into place. "Mom," he whispered, "what did you do?" Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. "You were so determined to succeed," she said softly. "All the banks had turned you down. You were so discouraged, so angry at the world. I couldn't bear to see your dreams die." "The loan, the anonymous benefactor," Christopher's voice cracked. "That was you?" She nodded. "I had finally saved enough to buy that little house I always wanted. It wasn't much, but it was mine. When I saw how much you needed the money for your business, I knew what I had to do. But why didn't you tell me? I would have found another way." "Would you have taken the money if you knew it came from me?" Evelyn asked gently. "You were so angry back then, so determined to leave our old life behind. You wanted to make it on your own." Christopher felt like he couldn't breathe. "But what happened after that? How did you end up on the streets?" Evelyn sighed. "Things got harder after I sold the house. Rent kept going up, and then I got sick. Medical bills piled up. I lost my job, and then my apartment. But I read about you in the papers. I saw how successful you were becoming. That made it all worth it." "Worth it?" Christopher stood up, running his hands through his hair in distress. "How could seeing me in the papers be worth living on the streets? I had more money than I could spend, and you were sleeping in an alley." "Because you're my son," Evelyn said simply, "and there's nothing in this world I wouldn't give up for you." Christopher fell to his knees in front of his mother, laying his head in her lap like he used to do when he was a little boy. Tears streamed down his face as the full weight of her sacrifice hit him. All these years he had thought his success was solely due to his own hard work and determination. He had been so proud of making it on his own, of proving everyone wrong. But the truth was, his very first step toward success had been bought with his mother's dreams. And how had he repaid her? By walking away, by ignoring her calls, by being too busy with his new life to check on her. While he had been attending galas and closing million-dollar deals, she had been struggling just to survive. "I'm so sorry," he sobbed. "I'm so sorry." Evelyn stroked his hair, just like she used to when he was small. "There's nothing to be sorry for," she said softly. "You were always meant for great things. I knew that from the moment you were born. But I forgot what was really important," Christopher said, looking up at her. "I forgot that none of this means anything without family." Outside the penthouse, windows, the city lights twinkled like stars. In offices across Manhattan, deals were being made. Fortunes were being won and lost. But none of that mattered anymore to Christopher Vaughn. In that moment, he made a promise to himself and to his mother. He would spend the rest of his life making up for the years they had lost. He would show her that her sacrifice hadn't just created a successful businessman. It had created a son who would never again forget the true meaning of love. The next morning, Christopher woke up on his living room couch. He had refused to leave his mother's side, afraid that if he went to his bedroom she might disappear. Evelyn was still sleeping in the guest room, and the early morning sunlight gave the penthouse a peaceful glow. His phone had dozens of missed calls. Claire had left several angry messages about him missing the gala. The board wanted to know why he had cancelled all his meetings, but none of that seemed important anymore. Sandra arrived early, carrying bags of groceries as Christopher had requested. Her eyes widened when she saw her boss in the same clothes from yesterday, his expensive suit wrinkled from sleeping on the couch. "Mr. Vaughan," she said carefully, "the board is very concerned. They're talking about calling an emergency meeting about the Miller acquisition." "Let them talk," Christopher replied, taking the groceries from her. "I need you to clear my schedule for the next week and find me the best doctors in the city. I want my mother to have a complete checkup today." Sandra's professional mask slipped for a moment. "Your mother." Before Christopher could explain, Evelyn appeared in the doorway of the guest room. Even in borrowed clothes, there was a natural grace about her that commanded attention. Sandra stared, trying to reconcile this gentle-looking woman with the ruthless businessman she had worked for all these years. "Good morning," Evelyn said, softly. "You must be Sandra. Christopher has told me what a wonderful assistant you are." Sandra couldn't help but smile. There was something about Evelyn that made you want to smile. "It's very nice to meet you, Mrs. Vaughan. Can I get you anything?" "Actually," Christopher interrupted, "I'll be making breakfast today." He turned to his mother. "You always made breakfast for me. Now it's my turn." As Christopher moved around his rarely used kitchen, pulling out pans and ingredients, his phone rang again. This time it was Claire. "Christopher, darling." Her voice dripped with artificial sweetness. "Everyone is talking about how you disappeared last night. The press is starting to ask questions. We need to make a statement." "Not now, Claire." "But darling, your image—" "I said not now." He hung up, turning his attention back to the pancakes he was trying to make. They were lumpy and slightly burned, nothing like the perfect ones his mother used to make, but Evelyn ate them as if they were the finest meal she'd ever had. "These remind me of the first time you tried to cook," she said, her eyes twinkling. "You were 12 and determined to make me breakfast for Mother's Day. You nearly burned down the kitchen." Christopher laughed, really laughed, for the first time in what felt like years. "I forgot about that. You weren't even angry. You just helped me clean up and then taught me the right way to do it." Their peaceful morning was interrupted by the arrival of Richard, Christopher's lawyer. He burst into the penthouse waving papers. "Christopher, we need to talk about the Miller deal. The board is threatening to—" "Oh." He stopped short when he saw Evelyn. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize you had company." "Richard," Christopher said firmly, "this is my mother. Mom, this is Richard Thompson, my lawyer." Richard's face went through a series of expressions as he connected the dots. "Mrs. Vaughan, the loan, I see." He looked uncomfortable. "Christopher, can we speak privately? Anything you need to say, you can say in front of my mother." Richard shifted nervously. "It's about the board. They're not happy about you canceling everything. There are rumors starting about your stability, your commitment to the company. The Miller family is threatening to pull out of the deal." "Let them," Christopher said calmly, surprising everyone in the room. "There will be other deals." "But Christopher," Richard sputtered, "this is a billion-dollar acquisition. The shareholders will have to wait. Right now my mother needs to see a doctor." As if on cue, Sandra returned with news that she had arranged appointments with several specialists for that afternoon. Christopher thanked her, then turned to his lawyer. "Richard, I need you to do something for me. Find out everything you can about what happened to my mother's old house. Who bought it, what it's worth now, everything. But the Miller deal, this is more important." Christopher's tone made it clear the discussion was over. After Richard left, clearly frustrated, Evelyn touched her son's hand. "You don't have to put your business at risk for me." "Yes, I do," Christopher said firmly. "For too long I've had everything backwards. I thought success meant having the biggest deals, the most money, the best connections. But I was wrong." He took his mother's, hands in his. "You gave up everything for me and I was too blind to see it. I became exactly the kind of person I used to hate, someone who only cared about money and status. But that changes today." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. "You've built such an amazing life for yourself. I don't want to cause problems." "You're not causing problems, Mom. You're helping me fix them." He squeezed her hands. "Now let's get you to those doctors." The rest of the day was a blur of medical appointments. Christopher insisted on the best specialists, the most thorough tests. Each doctor's visit revealed the toll that years of homelessness had taken on his mother's health. Malnutrition, untreated high blood pressure, arthritis that had worsened. Without proper care, the list seemed endless. But the worst moment came during a visit to a cardiac specialist. The doctor pulled Christopher aside after examining Evelyn. "Mr. Vaughan," the doctor said gravely, "your mother's heart condition is serious. She needs immediate treatment. Without it..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Christopher felt like someone had punched him in the gut. All his money, all his power, and he might still lose his mother because he hadn't been there when she needed him. Back at the penthouse that evening, while Evelyn rested, Christopher sat in his office, staring at an old photo of them together. His phone buzzed with a message from Claire. "Darling, there are rumors about you being seen with a homeless woman. We need to handle this before it affects your reputation. Call me." Christopher deleted the message without responding. Let them talk. Let the deal fall through. Let his carefully constructed image crumble. None of it mattered compared to the precious time he had wasted, the years he could never get back. A soft knock at his office door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Sandra. "Mr. Vaughan," she said hesitantly, "there's something you should know. I've been doing some research and, well, your mother wasn't always homeless. After she sold her house, she lived in a small apartment, but then something happened. Someone bought the building and doubled all the rents overnight. The new owner was Alexander Miller." Christopher felt his blood run cold. Alexander Miller, the same man whose company he was about to acquire. The man who had forced his mother onto the streets was the one he had been about to make even richer. In that moment, something shifted inside Christopher Vaughan. The deal wasn't just a business transaction anymore. It was personal, and he was going to make sure Alexander Miller learned exactly what it felt like to lose everything. Christopher spent the night in his office going through every piece of information he could find about Alexander Miller. The more he discovered, the angrier he became. Miller had made millions by buying up old buildings, forcing out long-time residents, and turning them into luxury apartments. His mother hadn't been the only victim. There were hundreds of others. The sun was rising when Sandra arrived at the office carrying 2 cups of coffee. She wasn't surprised to find her boss still awake. "I found something else," she said, handing him a coffee. "Miller's company is in trouble. They're hiding it well, but they're desperate for this acquisition to go through. That's why they agreed to your terms so quickly." Christopher smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Get Richard up here. Now." While they waited for the lawyer, Christopher called to check on his mother. Evelyn was still sleeping peacefully in the guest room, watched over by the private nurse he had hired. Richard arrived looking anxious. "Christopher, the board is meeting in an hour. They're voting on whether to remove you as CEO. You need to..." "Sit down," Christopher interrupted. "The deal with Miller is still on, but we're going to do it my way." For the next hour, Christopher laid out his plan. By the time he finished, even Richard was smiling. "It's brilliant," the lawyer admitted. "Ruthless but brilliant. Miller won't know what hit him." "Good, because we're doing it today. Call the board. Tell them I'll be at the meeting." Back at the penthouse, Christopher found his mother in the kitchen, trying to make breakfast despite the nurses' protests. "Mom, you should be resting," he said, gently taking the pan from her hands. "I've rested enough," Evelyn replied. "Besides, I want to make you breakfast before your meeting." Christopher stared at her. "How did you know about the meeting?" Sandra called to check on me. "She's a sweet girl." Evelyn touched his face. "You look tired, sweetheart. You're working too hard." "I'm fine. I just need to take care of something." "This wouldn't have anything to do with Alexander Miller, would it?" Christopher tried to hide his surprise, but his mother knew him too well. "Sandra told me about him," Evelyn said softly. "About what he did to the building where I lived. He's going to pay for that," Christopher promised. "No." Evelyn's voice was firm. "Revenge won't help anyone. It won't make up for lost time, and it won't make either of us happy." "But what he did to you was wrong," she agreed. "But destroying him won't change that. Use your power to help people instead. That would mean so much more." Before Christopher could respond, his phone buzzed. The board was waiting, Go, Evelyn said, squeezing his hand. But remember what I said. The boardroom was tense when Christopher arrived. 12 faces looked at him with varying degrees of concern and disapproval. At the other end of the table sat Alexander Miller, looking smug. Mr. Vaughan, Miller said smoothly, we were beginning to worry you'd lost interest in our deal. Christopher sat down, placing a thick folder on the table. On the contrary, I've become very interested in your company, Mr. Miller, particularly your real estate practices. Miller's smile faltered slightly. I'm not sure what you mean. No. Let me refresh your memory. Christopher opened the folder. 5 years ago, you bought a building in the Bronx. You doubled the rent overnight, forcing out dozens of families who had lived there for years. One of those residents was my mother. The room went silent. Miller's face had lost all color. Now, Christopher continued, I've spent the night going through your company's records. It seems you've been hiding some interesting information from your shareholders, information they might find very concerning. You're bluffing, Miller said, but his voice shook. Christopher pulled out a stack of papers. These are records of every building you've bought in the last 10 years. Every family you've forced out, every code violation you've covered up, every inspector you've bribed. He turned to the board. Miller's company isn't just morally bankrupt, it's actually bankrupt. He's been cooking the books for years. The only reason he agreed to this acquisition was because he's desperate for cash. The boardroom erupted in chaos. Miller jumped to his feet, shouting denials, but Christopher wasn't finished. I'm still going to buy your company, Miller, but not for the price we agreed on. You're going to sell it to me for exactly what you paid my mother for her house, adjusted for inflation, of course. You can't do this, Miller sputtered. Actually, I can, because right now you have two choices. Either accept my offer, or I send these documents to the SEC, the IRS, and every newspaper in the country. Miller collapsed back into his chair, defeated. Christopher stood up. Oh, and one more thing. Every resident you forced out of their homes, they're getting their properties back, with compensation for their suffering, and you're going to pay for it out of your own pocket. As he left the boardroom, Christopher felt lighter than he had in years. But his mother's words still echoed in his mind. Was revenge really the answer? Back at the penthouse, he found Evelyn sitting with Sandra, looking through old photo albums that his assistant had somehow tracked down. Oh, look at this one, Evelyn was saying, pointing to a picture. This was Christopher's first day of school. He was so nervous, but he wouldn't admit it. He just held my hand so tight. Sandra looked up as Christopher entered. Your mother has been telling me the most wonderful stories. Something about seeing them together. His mother, who had sacrificed everything for him, and his assistant, who had shown more loyalty and compassion than any of his high society friends, made Christopher realize his mother was right. The deal's done, he told them, but I think we need to make some changes to the plan. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. What kind of changes? Instead of just giving people back their homes, what if we did more? What if we created a foundation? One that helps people keep their homes in the first place, that fights against predatory landlords, that makes sure no other family has to go through what we did? His mother's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of joy. Now, that sounds like my Christopher. Sandra was already pulling out her tablet. I can start working on the paperwork right away. We'll need to set up a board of directors, establish funding, and I know just who should run it, Christopher said, looking at his mother. Someone who understands exactly what these families are going through. Someone with more compassion and wisdom than anyone I know. Evelyn started to protest, but Christopher took her hands in his. Mom, you've spent your whole life giving to others. Let me give something back. Let me help you help other people. For a moment, the penthouse was silent. Then Evelyn smiled, and Christopher knew he had finally made the right choice. Outside, the city continued its endless rush, but inside that penthouse, something beautiful was beginning. A mother's sacrifice was being transformed into hope for countless others. And a son who had lost his way was finally finding his true purpose. News of Christopher's confrontation with Miller spread through New York's business world like wildfire. The press was having a field day with the story of the ruthless CEO who had brought down a rival to avenge his homeless mother. Claire was leaving frantic messages about damage control, but Christopher ignored them all. He had more important things to worry about. His mother's health was still fragile, and the doctors were concerned about her heart condition. Every day, he made sure she took her medications, ate properly and got enough rest. But Evelyn was stubborn. She insisted on helping with the plans for the new foundation. "Mom, please," Christopher begged one morning when he found her at his home office desk surrounded by papers. "You need to take it easy." "I've been taking it easy for days," Evelyn replied, not looking up from the document she was reading. "Besides, these people need help now. Did you know the Ramirez family is about to lose their home? 3 children and nowhere to go." Christopher couldn't help but smile. Even after everything she'd been through, his mother's first thought was still for others. Sandra entered the office with their morning coffee. Over the past few weeks, she had become more than just an assistant. She was practically part of the family. Evelyn had taken her under her wing, treating her like the daughter she never had. "Mrs. Vaughn, I brought your heart medication," Sandra said, placing a pill bottle next to Evelyn's coffee. "Thank you, dear, and please, I've told you to call me Evelyn." She took her pills without complaint, then turned back to Christopher. "Now, about the Ramirez family." "Already taken care of," Sandra interjected. "I called the bank this morning. They've agreed to restructure the loan, and we're covering the back payments through the foundation's emergency fund." Evelyn beamed with pride. "See, this is why we need to keep working. Every day we wait is another day someone might lose their home." Before Christopher could argue further, his phone rang. It was Richard. "Turn on the news," the lawyer said without preamble. "Channel 7. Christopher grabbed the remote and switched on the office TV. His stomach dropped when he saw Alexander Miller's face on the screen. "Mr. Vaughn's accusations are completely false," Miller was saying to a crowd of reporters. "This is nothing but a personal vendetta. Yes, his mother was a tenant in one of my buildings, but she left voluntarily. And now he's using his power to destroy my company? The shareholders won't stand for this." The camera cut to another familiar face, Claire Henderson, Christopher's now ex-girlfriend. "Christopher has been acting very strangely lately," she said, her perfectly made-up face creased with fake concern. "First disappearing from important events, then this obsession with his mother. Many of us are worried about his mental state." Christopher switched off the TV, his hands shaking with anger. But before he could say anything, his mother's small hand covered his. "They're scared," Evelyn said softly. "People like them always are when their power is threatened." "I'll handle Miller," Sandra said, already typing on her tablet. "We have all the documentation. He's just digging himself deeper." "And Claire?" Christopher asked. "Leave her to me," Evelyn said, a glint in her eye that Christopher remembered from his childhood. The look she got when she was about to teach someone a lesson they wouldn't forget. Later that afternoon, while Christopher was in a meeting with the foundation's lawyers, Evelyn asked Sandra to arrange something special. When Claire Henderson arrived at her favorite restaurant for lunch, she found Evelyn Vaughn sitting at her usual table. "Mrs. Vaughn?" Claire faltered, her practiced poise slipping. "I'm afraid you're at my table." "Sit down, Miss Henderson," Evelyn said quietly. "We need to talk." Maybe it was the authority in Evelyn's voice, or maybe it was simple curiosity, but Claire sat. "I saw your interview this morning," Evelyn began. "You seemed very concerned about my son's mental state." Claire shifted, uncomfortably. "Well, you have to admit, his behavior—" "Let me tell you something about my son," Evelyn interrupted. "When he was 7 years old, he saw a classmate being bullied. The boy was poor like us, and the other kids were making fun of his worn-out shoes. Christopher took his own shoes off and gave them to the boy. He walked home barefoot that day." Claire blinked, thrown off by the story. "That's who my son really is," Evelyn continued. "Not the cold businessman you thought you knew, not the society figure you wanted him to be. He's someone who will walk barefoot to help others." She leaned forward. "So you can go on television and question his mental state all you want, but remember this. The man you're trying to destroy, he's finally becoming the person he was always meant to be." When Christopher returned home that evening, he found his mother looking tired but satisfied. "What did you do?" he asked, noticing the hint of a smile on her face. Just had a little chat with your ex-girlfriend, Evelyn replied innocently. I don't think she'll be giving any more interviews. True to her word, Claire Henderson disappeared from the media circus surrounding the Miller scandal. But Miller himself wasn't giving up so easily. The next morning, Richard arrived with troubling news. He's rallying support from other real estate developers, the lawyer reported. They're afraid you'll come after them next. They're threatening to pull their business from your company. Christopher was about to respond when he heard a crash from the kitchen. He ran in to find his mother collapsed on the floor, Sandra kneeling beside her. "Mom!" He rushed to her side, gathering her in his arms. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow. "Call an ambulance," he shouted to Sandra, who was already on the phone. As they waited for the paramedics, Evelyn gripped his hand. "Don't worry so much," she whispered. "I'm just a little tired." But Christopher could see the truth in her eyes. She had been pushing herself too hard, trying to help everyone else while her own health suffered. At the hospital, the doctors confirmed his worst fears. The stress had taken its toll on her heart. She needed immediate surgery. "The procedure is risky," the doctor warned. Given her age and condition, Christopher felt his world spinning. All his money, all his power, and he still might lose the most important person in his life. As they prepared Evelyn for surgery, she called Christopher to her bedside. "Promise me something," she said, her voice weak but determined. "Promise me you won't let this stop the Foundation's work. Those families need help, with or without me. Mom, don't talk like that. You're going to be fine," she squeezed his hand. "Promise me, Christopher. Promise you'll keep helping people." Tears streaming down his face, Christopher nodded. "I promise. But you have to promise me something too. Promise you'll fight. Promise you'll stay with me. I can't lose you again." Evelyn smiled, that same gentle smile she had given him 1,000 times before. "Oh, my boy," she whispered, "you never lost me. I've been with you every step of the way." As they wheeled her into surgery, Christopher realized that his mother's greatest gift hadn't been the money she gave up for his dream. It had been teaching him the true meaning of sacrifice, of love, of what really matters in life. Now he could only pray he would have the chance to show her he had finally learned that lesson. The hospital waiting room was quiet except for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Christopher sat with his head in his hands, while Sandra worked quietly nearby, managing the constant stream of calls and messages about the business crisis. But for once, Christopher didn't care about business. His entire world had narrowed, down to the double doors leading to the operating room, where his mother was fighting for her life. "Mr. Vaughn?" Sandra's gentle voice broke through his thoughts. "The board is demanding an emergency meeting. They're saying if you don't show up, they'll vote to remove you as CEO." "Let them," Christopher said, not looking up. "Nothing matters, except my mother right now." Richard burst into the waiting room looking flustered. "Christopher, you need to see this." He held up his tablet, showing a news website. The headline made Christopher's blood boil. "Vaughn Empire Crumbling, CEOs. Homeless mother story called into question." The article quoted anonymous sources, claiming that Evelyn wasn't really Christopher's mother, that it was all a scheme to take over Miller's company. There were even suggestions that he had paid a homeless woman to play the part. "Miller's behind this," Sandra said, her voice shaking with anger. "He's trying to discredit you both." Christopher stood up, pacing the waiting room. "How dare they? How dare they question my mother's integrity? After everything she's been through." A nurse approached them, and Christopher's heart stopped, but she was only bringing coffee that Sandra had ordered. "Any news?" Christopher asked. Desperately, the nurse shook her head. "The surgery's still ongoing. Dr. Phillips will come out as soon as there's anything to report." Hours crawled by. Christopher couldn't sit still. He walked the hospital corridors, remembering all the times his mother had taken care of him when he was sick as a child. She had worked extra shifts to pay for his medicine, gone without food so he could eat, never complaining, never asking for anything in return. Sandra found him staring out a window in the hospital chapel. "The news about Miller's article is spreading," she said softly. "But something interesting is happening. People are coming forward, dozens of them, former residents from his buildings, employees who witnessed his illegal practices. They all want to tell their stories." Christopher barely heard her. His mind was on a memory from long ago. He had been 10 years old with a high fever. His mother had stayed up all night, cooling his forehead with a damp cloth, singing softly until his fever broke. "Mr. Vaughan?" A new voice made him turn around. It was Maria Ramirez, the mother from the family they had helped save from eviction. She was standing there with a group of other people, families that the foundation had helped. "We heard about your mother," Maria said, her eyes filled with tears. "We wanted to be here, to pray with you." Christopher looked at the group in amazement. There must have been 20 or 30 people, all of them wearing worried expressions, all of them there to support him and his mother. "Mrs. Vaughan helped us keep our home," an elderly man said. "She listened to our story when no one else would. She brought toys for my children," another woman added. "She said every child deserves something to smile about." One by one they shared stories about Evelyn, how she had spent hours helping them with paperwork, how she had fought for their rights, how she had given them hope when they had none. In just a few short weeks she had touched so many lives. Tears streamed down Christopher's face as he listened. This was his mother's true legacy, not the money she had given him, but the love she had given others. Sandra organized coffee and sandwiches for everyone. The waiting room became a place of shared stories and quiet support. Even Richard, usually so focused on business, was moved by the gathering. Then, after what felt like eternity, Dr. Phillips appeared in his surgical scrubs. The room fell silent. Christopher couldn't breathe as he stood up. The doctor's face was unreadable. "The surgery was complicated," Dr. Phillips began. "Your mother's heart was weaker than we expected." Christopher felt his own heart stopping. "But," the doctor continued with a small smile, "she's a fighter. She made it through. She's in recovery now." The waiting room erupted in quiet cheers and tears of joy. Christopher collapsed back into his chair, overwhelmed with relief. "Can I see her?" he asked. "She's still unconscious, but yes, you can sit with her for a few minutes." In the recovery room, Evelyn looked so small and fragile among all the machines and tubes. Christopher took her hand gently. "You did it, Mom," he whispered. "You kept your promise. Now I'm going to keep mine." He kissed her forehead and pulled out his phone. It was time to end this once and for all. "Sandra," he said when his assistant answered, "call a press conference first thing tomorrow morning. It's time everyone knew the truth about Alexander Miller and about my mother." "What about the board meeting?" Sandra asked. "Schedule it for right after the press conference. And Sandra, get me everything we have on the board members' real estate dealings. Something tells me they're not going to like what I have to say." As he sat holding his mother's hand, Christopher felt a new kind of strength flowing through him. Miller and his allies had thought they could destroy him by attacking his mother. Instead, they had given him something to fight for that was more powerful than money or status: love, justice, and the chance to make his mother proud. Outside the hospital, reporters were gathering, drawn by the news of Evelyn's surgery. But they were about to learn that they had been focusing on the wrong story. The real story wasn't about a CEO's fall from grace or a homeless woman's rescue. It was about a mother's love, a son's redemption, and the power of simple human kindness to change the world. In her hospital bed, Evelyn stirred slightly, her fingers tightening around Christopher's hand. Even unconscious, she was still holding on to him, still supporting him, still showing him the way forward. "Rest now, Mom," he whispered. "I'll take care of everything. You taught me how." The morning of the press conference dawned bright and clear. Christopher had spent the night in his mother's hospital room, leaving only to change into a fresh suit that Sandra had brought him. Evelyn was still sleeping, but her color was better, and the doctors were optimistic about her recovery. "I'll be back soon, Mum," he whispered, kissing her forehead. "I'm going to make things right." The hospital lobby was packed with reporters and cameras. As Christopher walked through them, he noticed something different in their faces. The usual predatory hunger for scandal was mixed with something else: genuine curiosity and maybe even sympathy. The sight of all those families in the waiting room the night before hadn't gone unnoticed. Sandra had arranged for the press conference to be held in the hospital's conference center. As Christopher walked to the podium, he saw Alexander Miller and several board members sitting in the front row looking smug. They thought they had him cornered, Good morning, Christopher began, his voice steady. You've all been reporting on a story these past few weeks. A story about a powerful CEO who found his homeless mother and took revenge on his business rival. It's a good story, but it's not the whole truth. He pulled out an old photograph and held it up. It showed a much younger Evelyn, dressed in her waitress uniform, holding a small boy. This is my mother, Evelyn Vaughan, working her second job of the day. She worked 3 jobs to support us. When I was sick, she went without food to buy my medicine. When I needed school supplies, she sold her wedding ring. And when I needed money to start my business, she sold the only real home she'd ever owned. The room was completely silent now. But this isn't just about my mother. It's about hundreds of mothers, fathers, families who have been victimized by corrupt business practices. Mr. Miller, Christopher turned to face his rival. Would you like to explain to these reporters why you doubled the rent on buildings without making any improvements? Or why you bribed building inspectors to ignore code violations? Miller jumped to his feet. These are lies. You have no proof. Actually, I do. Christopher nodded to Sandra, who began distributing folders to the reporters. In these packets, you'll find documented evidence of every illegal practice, every forced eviction, every covered-up violation. And not just from Mr. Miller's company. He turned to face the board members. You'll also find similar documentation about properties owned by members of my own board, the same board that's been trying to remove me as CEO because I dared to stand up against these practices. The room erupted in chaos as reporters began flipping through the documents. Cameras flashed. Board members tried to leave but found their way blocked by families. Former tenants who had come to tell their stories. Mrs. Ramirez, Christopher called out. Would you like to tell everyone what happened when you fell behind on your rent? Maria. Ramirez stood up, her voice shaking but clear. They gave us 24 hours to leave. My children were crying. We had nowhere to go. But then Mrs. Vaughan found us. She and the foundation helped us keep our home. One by one, people stood up to tell their stories. Stories of hardship, of desperation, of losing everything, and then of finding hope through Evelyn and the foundation. This is the real story, Christopher continued when the room quieted. Not about revenge, but about justice. Not about power, but about compassion. My mother taught me that success isn't measured by how much money you make, but by how many lives you touch. He pulled out another document. That's why, effective immediately, I am transferring controlling interest in Vaughan Enterprises to the Foundation for Housing Justice. Every property we acquire will be converted into affordable housing. Every profit we make will go toward helping families keep their homes. The board members were on their feet now, shouting about shareholder rights and legal action. But Christopher wasn't finished, and Mr. Miller, the deal to buy your company is still on, but instead of forcing you out, I'm giving you a choice. You can fight us in court, where this evidence will become public record, or you can join us. Help us fix what you broke. Show the world that even the hardest heart can change. As if on cue, Sandra's phone buzzed. She hurried to Christopher's side and whispered something in his ear. His face broke into a smile. I've just received word that my mother is awake, he announced. She's asking about the Ramirez family's new apartment lease. Even from her hospital bed, she's still thinking of others. He looked directly into the cameras. That's who my mother is. That's who she raised me to be. And that's who we all should strive to be. The press conference ended with reporters scrambling to file their stories. As Christopher hurried back to his mother's room, he could hear Miller arguing with his lawyers in the hallway. The board members were huddled in corners, making frantic phone calls. But none of that mattered anymore. He found Evelyn sitting up, in bed, looking tired but alert. Sandra was already there, showing her pictures of the press conference on her tablet. You did good, sweetheart, Evelyn said as Christopher entered. But are you sure about giving up control of the company? Christopher sat on the edge of her bed and took her hand. I'm not giving anything up, Mom. I'm finally taking control, the right way, the way you taught me. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. I just wanted you to be successful. I am successful, Christopher replied. I have you back in my life. I'm helping people who need it. What could be more successful than that? Outside the hospital room, the world was changing. The stories were hitting the news, not just about Miller's corruption or Christopher's decision, but about a mother's love that had transformed greed into compassion, revenge into justice, power into purpose. Reporters were already calling it the biggest corporate shake-up in New York history. But in that quiet hospital room, a mother and son held hands and talked about simpler things, about family, about hope, about the future they would build together. And somewhere in the city, in apartments and homes that had almost been lost, families gathered around televisions and phones, sharing the news. The system that had almost destroyed them was being transformed by the very thing it had tried to ignore, the power of a mother's love. 3 weeks after the press conference, Evelyn was finally coming home from the hospital. But home wasn't Christopher's luxury penthouse anymore. He had surprised his mother by buying back their old house in the Bronx, the one she had sold to help him start his business. "Christopher, you didn't have to do this," Evelyn said as he wheeled her up to the familiar front porch. The house had been completely renovated, but they had kept its original charm. "Yes, I did," he replied, thinking of all the memories these walls held. "This is where we belong." Sandra was waiting inside with a small welcome home party. The Ramirez family was there, along with other families the foundation had helped. The house was filled with the smell of home-cooked food and the sound of children laughing. "Mrs. Vaughn." Maria Ramirez rushed forward to hug Evelyn gently. "We've missed you at the foundation meetings." "Tell me everything I've missed," Evelyn said, settling into her favorite armchair, the same one Christopher had found in storage and had restored for her. The news was better than anyone could have expected. After Christopher's press conference, other business leaders had started coming forward, wanting to be part of the change. The foundation was growing faster than anyone had anticipated. Even more surprisingly, Alexander Miller had accepted Christopher's offer. The man who had once thrown families out of their homes was now working with those same families, helping them become homeowners. "He's different now," Sandra reported. "Yesterday I saw him helping the Martinez kids with their homework while their parents filled out loan applications." "People can change," Evelyn said softly, "when you give them the chance." Richard arrived, later with more good news. The board members who had opposed Christopher had all resigned, replaced by community leaders and housing advocates. Vaughn Enterprises was becoming a model for ethical business practices. "The stock price actually went up after your announcement," Richard said, still sounding amazed. "Turns out there's a market for companies that put people first." Christopher smiled, remembering how he used to chase stock prices like they were the only thing that mattered. Now he measured success differently, by the number of families helped, homes saved, lives changed. As the party went on, he noticed his mother had dozed off in her chair. She still tired easily, but her doctors said she was getting stronger every day. The rest and peace of mind were doing what medicine alone couldn't. Later that evening, after the guests had left, Christopher found Evelyn in the kitchen, insisting on making tea despite Sandra's protests. "Mom, you need to rest," he said. "I've rested enough," she replied stubbornly. "Besides, we need to talk about the foundation's new project." Christopher raised an eyebrow. "What new project?" "The one I've been planning from my hospital bed." Evelyn's eyes twinkled. "Did you know there's an old school building for sale in the neighborhood? It would make perfect low-income senior housing, and the playground could be fixed up for the children in the area." "Always thinking of others," Christopher said, shaking his head with a smile. "I learned from experience how much a safe home means," Evelyn replied, "and how much it hurts to lose one." Christopher's smile faded as he remembered finding her in that alley. "I'm so sorry, Mum. I should have been there for you." "You're here now," she said simply, "and look at all the good that's come from it." She was right. Their reunion, painful as it had been, had sparked a movement. The foundation wasn't just saving homes anymore. It was changing how business was done in New York. The next morning, Christopher walked into his office, now located in a converted brownstone near his mother's house, to find an unexpected visitor waiting. Claire Henderson, his ex-girlfriend, looked very different from the polished socialite who had denounced him on television. Her designer clothes and perfect makeup were gone, replaced by a simple business suit. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," she said before Christopher could speak. "About who I am, about what really matters in life." "And what did you decide?" Christopher asked carefully. "That I want to help. My family owns properties too, you know. properties that could be used for something more important than luxury condos. Christopher studied her face, remembering his mother's words about giving people a chance to change. "Have you met with the Foundation's board?" he asked. Claire nodded. "Yesterday. Your mother suggested I start by volunteering at the homeless shelter where she used to stay. She said it would help me understand what really matters." Christopher couldn't help but smile. His mother was still teaching people, still changing lives. That afternoon, he had a meeting with Alexander Miller about converting one of his old buildings into a community center. The man who had once been his bitter enemy now looked to him for guidance. "Your mother visited the site yesterday," Miller said. "She had some ideas about adding a daycare center for working parents." "She's supposed to be resting," Christopher sighed. Miller smiled. "She said, and I quote, 'Rest is for people who don't have work to do.' That was his mother, always thinking of others, always looking for ways to help. Her heart might have been weakened by years of hardship, but its capacity for love and compassion had only grown stronger. As Christopher walked home that evening, he passed the alley where he had found his mother. It was different now, cleaned up with a small garden planted by neighborhood children. A sign hung on the fence. "Every end can be a new beginning. The Evelyn Vaughan Foundation." He found his mother on the front porch, surrounded by paperwork, with Sandra trying unsuccessfully to get her to take a break. "Just one more application," Evelyn was saying. "This family needs an answer by tomorrow." Christopher sat down beside her, taking the papers gently from her hands. "The work will still be there tomorrow, Mom. Right now it's time for your medicine and rest." Evelyn sighed but didn't argue. As she let him help her inside, she asked, "Are you happy, Christopher?" "Really happy." He looked around at their old house, now filled with new purpose. Through the window, he could see Sandra organizing the next day's meetings. On the coffee table were pictures of families who had been helped by the foundation, families who now had hope, just as he and his mother had found each other again. "Yes, Mom," he said, and for the first time in his life, he meant it completely. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." 6 months had passed since Evelyn came home from the hospital. The little house in the Bronx had become more than just a home. It was the heart of a community. Every morning, people would stop by with questions about housing applications, legal problems, or sometimes just for a cup of coffee and a sympathetic. Christopher had gotten used to finding his mother holding court at the kitchen table, dispensing advice and hope in equal measure. Today was no different. As he came downstairs, he found her with Maria Ramirez and 3 other women, all gathered around a pile of papers. "The bank can't refuse your loan application just because you're a single mother," Evelyn was saying firmly. "We'll have our lawyers look into this right away." "Mom," Christopher interrupted gently, "the doctor said you need to take it easy." "I am taking it easy," Evelyn protested. "I'm sitting down." "Aren't I?" The women around the table laughed, but Christopher noticed how tired his mother looked. Her recovery was going well, but she still pushed herself too hard. Sandra arrived with their morning coffee and a stack of newspapers. The headlines caught everyone's attention. Miller Industries CEO wins humanitarian award. There was a photo of Alexander Miller surrounded by smiling families in front of a newly renovated apartment building. "Can you believe it?" Maria asked, shaking her head. "The man who tried to evict us is now winning awards for helping people like us." "People can surprise you," Evelyn said, smiling. "Sometimes they just need someone to believe in them." Christopher knew she wasn't just talking about Miller. His own transformation had been just as dramatic. The ruthless businessman who once cared only about profits was gone, replaced by someone his mother could truly be proud of. Later that morning, Christopher had a meeting at the Foundation's new headquarters, the converted school building Evelyn had spotted months ago. The playground was filled with children, while their parents attended job training classes inside. The senior housing units on the upper floors were almost complete. Claire Henderson was waiting in his office. She had surprised everyone with her dedication to the Foundation's work. The former socialite now spent her days working directly with homeless families, helping them transition into permanent housing. The Henderson Properties Board approved the proposal, she announced without preamble. "We're converting all our luxury developments into mixed-income housing." Christopher smiled. remembering how she had once cared only about appearing in society magazines. "Your father agreed to this?" "Actually, it was his idea," Claire replied. "After meeting your mother, well, she has that effect on people." Yes, she did. Evelyn's influence had spread far beyond their neighborhood. Business leaders across the city were rethinking their practices. Other foundations were copying their model. Change was happening one home at a time. That afternoon, Christopher had another surprise visitor, his old driver, James. The man had been with him through his ruthless business days, watching silently as his boss climbed the corporate ladder. "Sir," James said hesitantly, "I was wondering if the foundation might need another volunteer, since you don't need a driver anymore." Christopher looked at the older man with new understanding. "Actually, we do need someone to help transport. Families to job interviews and medical appointments. Someone trustworthy who knows the city." James's face lit up. "I'd be honored, sir." As Christopher watched his former driver fill out volunteer paperwork, he thought about how many lives had been changed, not just the families they helped, but everyone who came into contact with the foundation's work. Richard arrived with the latest financial reports. The foundation was growing faster than anyone had expected. Companies that had once been their fiercest competitors were now their strongest supporters. "Your mother's idea about the Community Development Fund is brilliant," Richard said. "Teaching people to invest in their own neighborhoods, it's revolutionary." "That's Mom," Christopher replied proudly. "She always sees the potential in everything, and everyone." He found himself thinking about the day he found her in that alley. At the time, it had seemed like the worst moment of his life. Now he understood it had been the best, the moment that set him on the path to becoming the person he was meant to be. Sandra interrupted his thoughts with urgent news. "The governor's office just called. They want to meet with you and Mrs. Vaughan. They're interested in implementing our housing model statewide." Christopher's first thought was that it would be too much for his mother, but when he got home and told her the news, Evelyn's eyes lit up with that familiar fire. "Think of how many families we could help," she said excitedly. "If we could change. The laws make the system fairer. Mum, your health is fine," she interrupted firmly. "The doctors said my heart is stronger. And what better way to keep it strong than by using it to help others?" Looking at her face, glowing with purpose and passion, Christopher couldn't argue. His mother had spent her whole life giving up her dreams for his, giving away her home to help him start his business, giving her time and energy to help others even when she had nothing left for herself. But now, finally, she was getting something back. Not just a comfortable home or good medical care, but the joy of seeing her sacrifice bear fruit in ways she had never imagined. That evening, they sat on the front porch together, watching the neighborhood children play in the street. Next door, the Martinez family was having a barbecue, the smell of grilling food mixed with the sound of laughter and music. "Remember when you were little?" Evelyn asked suddenly. "You used to say you were going to buy a big house and take me away from here." Christopher felt a pang of guilt. "I was ashamed of where we came from. I didn't understand then what really matters. And now." He looked around at the neighborhood he had once been so desperate to escape. The houses weren't fancy, but they were homes. The people weren't rich, but they were family, not just to each other, but to him and his mother. "Now I understand that true wealth isn't about what you have," he said softly. "It's about what you give." Evelyn squeezed his hand, tears in her eyes. "You know what makes me proudest?" she asked. "Not the foundation or the lives we've changed or even finding you again. What makes me proudest is that you finally understand what I've known all along, that love is the only investment that never fails." As the sun set over their little house in the Bronx, Christopher thought about how far they had come and how far they still had to go. There were more families to help, more lives to change, more love to give. But for now, sitting with his mother on their front porch, watching their community thrive, he was exactly where he needed to be. The ruthless businessman was gone, replaced by the son his mother had always believed he could be. And in the end, that was worth more than all the wealth in the world. 1 year had passed since the day Christopher found his mother in that alley. The little house in the Bronx was decorated for a celebration, with flowers and balloons filling every corner. It was Evelyn's birthday, but it had become much more than that. It was a celebration of everything they had accomplished together. The EU. Governor had just signed the Evelyn Vaughan Housing Rights Act, guaranteeing affordable housing protections across the state. The foundation's model was being copied in cities across the country, but more importantly, their neighborhood had become a real community again, where people looked out for each other and no one had to face their struggles alone. Christopher stood in the kitchen, watching his mother hold court in the backyard. She was sitting in her favorite chair, surrounded by children from the neighborhood. The doctors had been amazed by her recovery over the past year. They said it was like her heart had been healed not just by medicine, but by love and purpose. "Tell us again about the alley, Mrs. Vaughan," one of the children begged. "Yeah, tell us how Mr. Christopher found you," another chimed in. Evelyn laughed. "You've heard that story 100 times, but it's our favorite," the children insisted. Christopher smiled, remembering how different things had been a year ago. He had been so lost then, surrounded by wealth, but empty inside. Finding his mother hadn't just saved her, it had saved him too. Sandra appeared at his side, clipboard in hand as always. But now she was more than just an assistant. She had become part of their family, even moving into the apartment above the garage so she could be closer to help Evelyn. "Everything's ready for the announcement," she said softly. Christopher nodded. They had been planning this surprise for months. The foundation had finally raised enough money to buy back every building Miller had ever owned, turning them all into affordable housing. But that wasn't the biggest news. Alexander Miller himself stepped into the kitchen looking nervous. The past year had changed him too. Working with the families he had once tried to evict had taught him what really mattered in life. "Are you sure about this?" he asked Christopher. "It was Mom's idea," Christopher replied. "And she's usually right about these things." Out in the backyard, more guests were arriving. Maria Ramirez and her family, the Martinez kids, Claire Henderson, who now ran her family's charitable foundation, and dozens of others whose lives had been touched by Evelyn's love and wisdom. Richard arrived with the final papers, followed by a group of reporters. This announcement was going to make headlines, but for once Christopher didn't care about the press. He only cared about his mother's reaction. "Mom," he called out, stepping into the backyard, "we have something to tell you." The crowd quieted as Christopher, Miller, and Richard stepped forward. Evelyn looked up from her storytelling, curiosity in her eyes. "A year ago," Christopher began, his voice thick with emotion, "I thought success meant having the biggest company, the most money, the most power. I thought I had to leave this neighborhood behind to be somebody. But you taught me that true success isn't about what you take, it's about what you give." He nodded to Miller, who stepped forward with a thick envelope. "Mrs. Vaughan," Miller said, his voice humble, "a year ago I was a man who had lost his way. I had forgotten that buildings aren't just property. They're people's homes, their dreams, their futures. You helped me remember what it means to be human." He handed her the envelope with shaking hands. Inside were property deeds, hundreds of them. "Every building I ever owned," Miller explained. "They're all being transferred to the foundation, but not just as affordable housing. Each building will have a community center, job training programs, childcare facilities, everything families need to thrive." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears as she looked through the papers. But Christopher wasn't finished. "And Mom, there's more." He took out another document. "The foundation isn't just getting Miller's properties. Every major real estate company in the city has agreed to set aside 30% of their properties for affordable housing. They're calling it the Evelyn Vaughan Initiative." The crowd burst into applause, but Christopher raised his hand for silence. "But the biggest news, Mom, the governor just called. They want to make our foundation's model national. They want you to head a new federal housing commission." Evelyn sat in stunned silence, looking at the papers in her hands. Finally, she spoke. "All this," as she said softly, "from finding me in that alley." "No, Mom," Christopher corrected gently. "All this from your love, from the sacrifice you made 20 years ago when you sold your house to help me start my business. From every kindness you showed to others, even when you had nothing yourself. From your belief that everyone deserves a chance at a better life." He knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. You never gave up on me, Mom. Even when I forgot where I came from, even when I was too proud to call, even when I walked past homeless people without a second glance. You never stopped loving me. You never stopped believing I could be a better person. Tears were flowing freely now, not just from Evelyn and Christopher, but from many in the crowd. They all knew the story, how a mother's love had transformed not just her son, but an entire city. So what do you say, Mom? Christopher asked. Ready to help us change the whole country? Evelyn looked around at the crowd, at Maria's children, playing with the Martinez kids, at Claire wiping tears from her eyes, at Miller standing tall and proud in his redemption, at Sandra beaming with family pride. She saw the community they had built, the lives they had touched, the hope they had created. On one condition, she said finally, her eyes twinkling, we do it from right here, this house, this neighborhood. This is where we belong. Christopher hugged her tightly, remembering that terrible night in the alley. He had thought he was rescuing her, but the truth was, she had rescued him. Her love had given him back his soul. As the party continued around them, Christopher sat beside his mother, holding her hand just as she had held his through all the hardships of his childhood. Outside their little house in the Bronx, the city was changing. Hope was replacing despair, compassion was replacing greed, love was healing old wounds, and it had all started with a mother's love, a love so powerful it could transform not just one life, but countless others. A love that proved that sometimes the greatest wealth isn't found in bank accounts or business deals, but in the simple act of giving your heart to others. In the end, that was Evelyn's greatest gift to her son, not the money she had sacrificed for his dream, but the lesson that true success comes from using your blessings to bless others. And as they sat together, on that beautiful afternoon, surrounded by the community they had built, both mother and son knew that they had finally found the real meaning of wealth, love that grows richer the more you give it away.